Hi folks, Harry Frank from graymachine.com. Today we're going to talk about expressing your color. We're going to use some expressions to control color variation in a plugin. Now to do this I'm going to use radio waves to demonstrate this. We're going to dive into controlling RGB and HSL values on a color property in a plugin. So radio waves is a perfect place to do this because what we can do is have each of these waves have a little bit of variation in color as they're born, along with variation in size, which is pretty easy. We can just throw a wiggle on that, and I'll show that. But creating variation in color is not just a simple matter of throwing wiggle on there. So let me show you how to do this. So working in a blank comp, I'll create a new solid, call this waves, and apply the effect radio waves. Now by default it looks like this, all identical in size and color. Now we can go into the color property here under the stroke section and change what color this stroke is as these waves are born. Pretty straightforward. Now I'm going to go in and modify the start width and make these a little more frequent. And like I said, we are going to create some variation in the size of the stroke by using a simple wiggle expression. So we'll just go into the start width here and create an expression for that. So I'll just do that right there, and then jump down here, we'll type wiggle. We'll do it 2 times a second, and we'll have it as much as 30 pixels in width. So this will have a decent amount of variation in the stroke width. Now that's all fine and good, but they're all the same color. Now the cool thing about radio waves, because this is a very cool plugin, I really like it, and it's kind of underutilized I think, is that if we change the color over time, it's not going to change all of the waves. This is just the color at the time the wave is produced. So if this color is continuously changing, we're going to have a lot of different variation in the color. Now if we use an expression to do this, we're going to have to master the process of RGB and HSL conversion within expressions. So you might be wondering, why is this just not a matter of creating wiggle on the color? Well, let me show you what that looks like. Let me say I'll just use wiggle 1 time a second, and we'll just use a variation of perhaps 2 in any direction. Now if I play this, our colors are going to go all kinds of crazy. There's no predictability, there's no subtle hue variation going on. These are just all over the place. Now why is it doing this? Well, color in expressions and in JavaScript in general are expressed as RGB values. So there's no hue shift going on here. There is just variation in red, green, and blue independently. And effectively it looks something like this. Our red, green, and blue values are being wiggled around randomly. However, because wiggle goes above and below the value that we specify as our limit, we run the risk of even having values that go below 0, which doesn't make sense at all for an RGB value. There is no negative value, and there is also nothing above 1. RGB values are always expressed from 0 to 1, no matter what color depth you're working in. So you're going to get all kinds of crazy results here because our colors are just going, to use a technical term, going willy-nilly. There's no predictability and, well, usefulness to this that I can see. What we really want is something that is expressed as a hue. Now this makes a lot more sense to us. We have a color spectrum here. We can create some variation in an area of a color spectrum. So it wouldn't be great if we could have all of our radio waves be born in a certain range of the color spectrum with subtle variations on each one. To do this, we need to define our colors as a hue, saturation, and lightness value rather than RGB. Fortunately, within After Effects and After Effects expressions, there is an easy way to convert RGB and HSL values back and forth. So let me show you how to do this. So let's get rid of this wiggle here and create an expression. What we're going to do is define a variable that I'm going to call RGB. And this will be equal to the existing color of our stroke. And I'll put a semicolon to close up that variable. Now I'm going to declare a variable called HSL. HSL is going to be equal to something called RGB to capital TO capital HSL. So RGB to HSL, and then in parentheses I'm going to put the term that I would like to convert to HSL, and that is going to be this variable called RGB. So I'm converting this RGB to HSL. Now what this does is it leaves this as a 0 to 1 value. However, instead of being red, green, and blue, these are now values of hue, saturation, and lightness. So we have a 0 to 1 value of hue, 0 to 1 of saturation, and 0 to 1 of lightness. This makes it a lot easier to control. So next I'm going to create a variable called hue. And wouldn't it be great if I had some sort of slider that can control this hue? So that's actually what I'm going to do right now. I'll jump out of here and we're going to get an error. That's fine. Okay. And to this layer, I'm going to apply an expression control called the slider control, and we'll call this hue. So I'm going to pick whip that value. So I've got a slider over here that I can use to create variation in the color of this stroke. I'm going to come back to this. Now, so to create this hue shift, I'm going to set this HSL value equal to HSL plus hue, and then I'll leave saturation and lightness alone. So we're adding to this array here another array. This array is going to consist of a hue shift for the first value in the array, and the second and third values are 0. So these will leave the saturation and lightness alone, but we will create some hue variation. Now, as a last step, because remember, our colors are always expressed in RGB. So because we've converted it to HSL to make it easier for us to work with, we still need to convert it back to RGB for this color to work properly. Fortunately, there is a way to go back. So I can type HSL to capital TO, capital R, lowercase g, b. Don't let that trip you up. That's messed me up a couple times. So HSL to RGB, this HSL variable right here. This is the value that we've converted to HSL and then added a little bit of a hue shift to, and then we're converting it back here at the end. So this is all fine, but what we got to worry about is this thing right here that's going to be creating our hue variation. Now this slider we can use to slide all over the place, but remember, our values in both RGB and HSL are expressed from 0 to 1. So rather than using the slider from a minuscule value of 0 to 1, it would be great to be able to think about this as a true hue shift in terms of a 0 to 360 hue shift. So all we need to do that is divide this by 360. So if this is 180, this is simply going to be a value of 0.5. This is going to do the necessary calculation that we'll need to add the appropriate hue shift from 0 to 1. So now if I jump out of this and I go to my hue control here, now I'm just going to add a simple wiggle on this slider. Wiggle, let's say 1 time a second, and we'll give it a 20-degree variation in any direction. So now as these waves are born, we get a 20-degree hue shift in any direction. If I make this more drastic, maybe 40, we start to get cyans, purples, and on top of our blues. And we get some nice color variation in our radio waves. all thanks to a built-in function called RGB to HSL and HSL to RGB. There's a lot of ways you can use this, but this is a very good way to show how to use RGB to HSL, which kind of eluded me for the longest time, and now I've started to embrace it and have fun with it. So thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.